All right, looks like we are live today. Hello everyone and welcome back to Mission Top. Mission Top is a place, it's a farmstead and ranch, it's a family, it's my family. My name is Gary Nuila, but it's also a place of ideas, it is a process, and it is a way of life. And today we're going to talk about some of the ideas that we are trying to implement here at Mission Top. This is the third of a series of videos we've been talking about the metagame. And each day I think it's going to be the last one, and today definitely is going to be the last one. But I wanted to give this topic its proper time because ultimately this term that we're using, metagame, is really just a stand-in for something very broad. It's a reconceptualization, you could say, of the basic way of life we are trying to live as a society. And so this is my attempt to articulate what could be some of the rules of a new game to play as society, is the way that we're conceptualizing it. That we already are trying to implement and live here at Mission Top. And evaluate these rules and modify them as we go. So I want to share them with you, put them out there for your consideration, I guess you could say. Those that you think have merit, you are invited to live yourself. And in that process of living them and trying to implement this new game, if it's something that interests you, you can give the feedback of how it's working. You can try to contribute to the conceptualization of how these rules are explained or framed, because ultimately this is a game. It is a metagame in that sense of a game kind of beneath a game that is creating the game itself, right? So that's another way that this term metagame really falls in and applies to this. So we're going to try to wrap up all the rules that I've been able to come up with thus far and kind of tie this whole topic up so that we can move on to other things in future videos. So the very first thing I want to leave off with today is this term metagame. What I often see is that within any kind of grouping of people or organization or way of thinking, what happens very often is that the group starts using a language, starts using all these terms so they can talk with each other and understand each other. But the danger is that very soon they start developing this particular language that only they understand and others don't. And I want to avoid this for very particular reasons. I want to avoid that kind of pattern in this group of people, yourself and anyone that's considering this. So I'm using this term metagame, but right here at the very beginning of today's video, I want to throw out other terms that could be used. So that in explaining this to others, if you talk about others, you could use the term metagame if you want, but easily you could jump into other terms that would help people to understand, because that is a skill I think we need in our more pluralistic societies and world that we are living in, is this ability to jump across language and use terms that apply to the audience or the people that we are speaking to. So what are other ways of describing the metagame? I would say that it is a way of life. Okay, that's one way of conceptualizing it. It's a new, it's trying to reconceptualize the way of life that everybody is living right now in society. So we've said that the basic way of life that is kind of underlying most of our lives in Western society is this kind of market capitalistic way of life that we devote our most of our waking hours to. And that is the game we're playing, right? So another way of saying it is it's a fundamental narrative. It's a story, ultimately. And one thing in developing this is it's not quite in a great story form yet. So that is one thing I want to try to develop over time, because I've noticed that any movement that has merit over time always develops into a story, because it is so much easier for humanity to digest stories rather than just abstract concepts. And so it's really, that is something kind of yet to be done with this grouping of rules and this way of playing a game, is it needs to develop into a story over time. But that's one way of framing it, is that it is a fundamental narrative, a story that you can live within. Okay? And another term for it would be worldview. That's one that gets thrown around. So this is kind of trying to conceptualize a new worldview. a way of taking in the world. Not just the planet Earth, but the world as we experience it, which encompasses all sorts of different levels of reality or different levels of being. And I'm going to get into what I mean by levels of reality or levels of being today, that takes in all of our experiences as an individual, as a family, our experience in kind of an ecological environment, in a society, in our planet, in our universe, all of it. All of that is taken into the world, and it is our world view, kind of the way that we see all of that together, that we're talking about in this. So fundamental narrative, worldview, way of life, metagame, we're all basically talking about the same thing using those terms, and you can use those kind of terms with others in explaining this. So one thing I want you to see also is that our religions do give us this kind of fundamental narrative. They're the things that have provided us with fundamental narratives in the past, or stories, that people could live their entire lives in, that framed the entire world in a way that people could understand. And so that has been probably the most effective means in order to get societies to live together, is through religion. But in the last couple hundred years, as we've started living in more pluralistic societies, there's also been these more government or societal kind of system narratives, the narrative of our countries and history, the narrative of these systems of organizing ourselves, such as capitalism and communism, and you see whole governments can do this with fascism. So that kind of shows how once the religious narratives are lost, or maybe there's many religious narratives competing in a society, oftentimes societies default to that more to a government kind of narrative, and that can work. For example, the United States has a narrative about its own country, and most countries today have a narrative, that kind of a mythical history that people can live within and kind of frame who they are as a people, and those are good as far as they go. But what the bad thing is that we can see in the 20th century when this kind of way of thinking start to be totalizing systems, that try to make a fundamental framing that takes into account everything and tries to get everybody to fall within that. And so this would be, Nazism and communism are the best examples of what happens when you try to impose one of these, fundamental totalizing narratives on a society that has all sorts of other narratives already going on, and tries to get people to eliminate those narratives in order to fit into this totalizing one, right? So that's another important point to point out, is this is not trying to be that kind of narrative or worldview or metagame. We're trying to design something here, you could say, or play something here, play a game here, that can take into account all these other worldviews, religious narratives, government systems. This isn't requiring any government to change its system and saying, capitalism is bad or socialism is bad or things like that, because it's just not realistic in the world today to try to get everybody to fall under one system. And so the set of rules that we're trying to articulate here are ones that can be implemented wherever a society is. But it's not just a society, right? It's all the levels of being. So any individual can implement as an individual. Any family can implement as a family. And yet, even though it doesn't require, some fundamental, a totalizing system, if everybody was applying these rules, there would be this overall greater kind of narrative or worldview that people start living in that I think would result better or produce better results in our pluralistic set of societies that we live in today. Okay, so that is what we're doing with this. And over these days of thinking about this, I just wanted to make sure we had clear what is the objective of trying to reframe this metagame that we're doing. Okay, so I've already kind of hinted at that one thing we have to do as we specify these rules is make sure that they can scale up and down to every level of being, or else they're not very good rules. And this game is ultimately failing at what I think it needs to do to be a new and exciting game, essentially, to play for society. So what I mean by that is that as we evaluate these rules, we need to make sure that they can be implemented, as I was just saying a few minutes ago, at every scale of being, at the level of an individual, a family, a community, a society, and ultimately the world. And that is one, if we see that they work that way, that's one indication that they are the right rules, because that means they ultimately can be implemented across the board and be helpful in that way. Okay, so those were the preliminaries that I wanted to get into today. Now let's jump back into the rules themselves. So I'm going to go in much quicker fashion through the rules that we've already covered. And of course, in having a day to think about them, there's a few points here and there that I wanted to use to clarify where I don't think I was as clear or effective yesterday. So let's start going through the rules real quick and seeing if we can do a little bit better of a job yesterday and also just move through them quicker overall. So first rule was always be willing to revamp the rules of the metagame. Always be willing to consider them fresh. And this kind of gets us into a fundamental position of humility. You know, it's okay to say we think we're right, but it's being able to answer that question. Might I be wrong? And then we talked about that the best way to test out these rules is to live them. And the best way to improve these rules is to live them. And in doing that, they will show their weaknesses, they will show the ways they need to be changed, and new rules will evolve as we live them. So those are two important kind of fundamental rules from the outset, right? That are again, kind of meta rules that help you then create the rest of the rules. We then talked about not trying to achieve an end state. You know, I was kind of talking yesterday that there is no end state, and in a way, you know, that is the case, but I was thinking about it, and just kind of naturally, we always need to have a goal. You know, a goal is an end state. And so we do have to frame oftentimes what we're heading towards in terms of our best version, our best end state of what we can. But what we need to not do is expect to ever achieve it. Or it is okay to achieve it, in fact, but don't think that that's the end, right? That's the important thing. It's a receding, you know, these goals are receding horizons. We look out to the horizon and see the best possible place we could head, and we target that, we move towards it, and sometimes we even get there. You know, maybe it's the top of yonder hill right there. We work to get to that point, we get there, and we realize, boom, here's another landscape and another horizon out there. And oftentimes, even before we get where we want to go, we realize, oh, there's way more beyond that. And that's the important thing to see, is that no particular end state should be the ultimate destination. Even though, again, I'm modifying yesterday by saying it is useful to set end states to head to in that process. And so process is actually the word that I want to focus on. The overall goal is just to be in the process of moving towards better and better end states. And I called this process the way. And I wanted to add that, you know, I mentioned how the way is tied into Christianity, but it's not just Christianity. And that's one reason I love it as a symbol, because you see it is a symbol. You know, a way is a path. It's as in Spanish, a camino. You know, it's a path, it's a trail, it's something to get into that heads in a direction. And lots of systems use or especially religious systems, use the idea of the way. And it's something we all experience in life. You know, we all inherently know what a way is. And so it's something you'll find in Eastern religions. It's that dividing, you know, wavy line in the middle of the yin-yang symbol that I oftentimes like to use. And so there we have Eastern religions that use it. And so that's why I'm choosing this as kind of the fundamental symbol to embody this pattern of this pattern of progress, is this way. So I wanted to point that out, that it's a broad symbol. And you notice that those are the kind of symbols that I'm trying to choose. Symbols that are inherently part of the human experience. And because of that, I often find them in almost every religion, right? Because that's what religions do, is help you to see parts of the human experience that then you can look through to help you understand kind of higher principles, right? So in this metagame, I'm trying to grab onto the most fundamental symbols that we all have experience with. And as we go, you know, help me to see other symbols that would be attractive to use in certain places, because when it comes down to it, symbols are the ways we can get these 2.5 hour videos that I'm making down to very compact packages, because symbols are so effective at holding lots of information within them. And this is a topic I'd love to get into when we do a series on temples in the world and what temples have always done for humanity. And their temples are filled with symbols. Okay, so that's the way. And again, I wanted to pause on that for a little bit. But we talked about how in getting into that way, then it's about just being in that path, progressing towards what we want to go to. And so it's getting into that being mode rather than the having mode. It's not about having the thing at the destination, getting some prize, that our current society focuses on, about, getting that money or obtaining that degree or things like that. It's more about being in the process of progress. And so we talked about that. We said that there's a nice phrase that I've tried to come up with is, seek to build heaven without completing it, and you will dwell in heaven. Because as it turns out, when we're in that path, there are some tremendous rewards that come from being in that state of being. We talked about the rock climber, being in the flow state, progressing towards something that they're aiming at, but it's not about getting there, it's about being in the flow state, is why the rock climber climbs. And so that's what we should all be striving for. We talked about what should we be aiming for, and in essence, the answer is the highest possible good. And as we try to encompass more and more humanity into this, that's kind of where we have to, stop, is just to say the highest possible good, because of course, humanity always fights about what is that highest possible good, and rightly so. It's always hard to conceptualize because it's a receding horizon. So we need to give people the space to conceptualize what is the highest possible good, but maybe we could at least agree on that would be the best thing, the highest possible imaginable thing. And I do give this a name, and I try to give at least somewhat of a framework to it, and I call it the divine family. And so basically it's the ideal masculine, the ideal feminine, and the ideal unity of those two, or the ideal child, you could say. And the reason I choose those things is because, again, it's something that every single person in humanity thus far experiences, right? They experience the masculine, the feminine, and the child. They, in essence, are made up of those three things. So it's at every scale of reality, including very practical ones, such as we all are born into this world as a child and as a union of the masculine and feminine. And so that's why I use those as one way to frame the highest possible good, is to divide it into those three fundamental things that every person in humanity experiences. And I think it's very potent when you actually start considering that, because it's so part of our experience, but also that is different than the way that a lot of things have proceeded in the last couple hundred years, or even more than that, where a lot of fundamental narratives and conceptions have left out, particularly the feminine, out of the picture, you could say. And that's been a big problem, I think, for society. It's something we've been dealing with now for well over 100 years at least. I mean, probably more time than that, depending on how you want to, again, frame it. And so by bringing in those things, we are both, at a very practical level, considering men, women, and children, right? But it's beyond just men, women, and children. It is masculine, feminine, and the union of those two. And so it does scale, again, at every level of reality. And again, because it's, what I'm framing as the fundamental good, of course we could talk about that forever, and we're not going to. We'll explore things, over time in that vein as we proceed in videos that I make or other live streams or things like that. But I said there's a constraint to what we should aim at in framing this thing we aim at. It needs to be the highest possible thing we can imagine that we would actually do, not just some whatever we can imagine, and again, the rainbow unicorns and things like that. But it has to be things that we'd actually move towards, and not just fanciful notions. Then we got into some kind of very specific rules of thumb, very good guiding rules of thumb that I find, such as don't do anything that makes the world worse off, okay? And on the one hand, I mean, that is such an obvious thing. Everyone should be like, of course. But on the other hand, every day, myself included, we break that rule, right? In the way that we've structured society today. And so that's one reason we should be constantly reminding ourselves of that rule and striving to move towards it. Coupled with that rule is the rule, only do that which makes the world more beautiful, right? Or at least no less beautiful. And I found this to be a very guiding rule, because with whatever you're doing, it is beauty that I think is inherently tied into meaning itself. And so by asking yourself what would make the world more beautiful, you inherently are making the world more meaningful. And meaning is what makes life satisfying and fulfilling. And so inherently, if you make the world more beautiful, you'll be making a more satisfying world that people want to live in, that they thrive in, that they wake up every day enjoying and loving being a part of. Instead of, like we see today, some people, like just again in a shooter in Colorado in the United States, somebody who's trying to destroy the world, to find something inherently wrong with the world and other people within it, So you can see the value of these rules if we could inculcate these into our children, into society, into the regular way that we think about things. If we were all striving each day to make the world a little more beautiful, as cheesy as that could sound if it wasn't serious, but I'm serious about it, then this world could become an even more beautiful place very quickly. If you even got, a quarter of the population, half of the population, or even less than that, focusing on that day to day, right? As part of that, the world would be filled, as we said, more with life and enchantment and spirit. But more than that, with these notions of making the world better off, making it more beautiful, it even applies at levels not just in aesthetic beauty and things like that, but even at levels such as economic systems and businesses and things of that, much more practical nature. So that's where I wanted to bring in today, that I should have mentioned yesterday, this book that I think is a very useful book called Holistic Management, A Common Sense Revolution to Restore Our Environment by Alan Savory. Okay, and this book is an important book. It's funny because I don't necessarily recommend it for like the direct topic it's focusing on, which he is focusing on environment, ecology, agriculture. But within it, what he proposes is something very deep and very much tied into what I am talking to right now this morning, which is that we should have a framework, a management system, you could say, for making decisions. And in this management system, when we make any decision, we should take in a holistic context for any decision making. And by that, you mean that you would take into these considerations we have. Does this decision we're doing and this project we're pursuing, this thing that we're managing, is it actually improving the world? Right? Is it making the world more beautiful? And so, in his kind of framework, considerations that should come into like any business decision, any corporation, any business decision that's considering things, they should be considering things such as the water cycle, soil degradation, the mineral cycle, things like that, which oftentimes businesses actually very directly affect, but don't think of much, right? And so in doing that, in taking much more of a holistic view of the world, you actually make the world better off even for the business itself. Because, if a business that ultimately relies on healthy soils and the mineral cycle and things like that, this would be like agriculture businesses, but when it comes down to it, it's nearly every business, because we rely ultimately, processes so often start at these basic levels of the environment, right? And so if those things are taken into account, then the business can continue on into the future, whereas a lot of the things that we've done end up affecting the world in ways that degrade the game space, as I've said in the past, such that little games that have been playing in the past, like corporations, are hurt as to their bottom lines because they didn't take into account this more holistic context of the world. All right, and so that's a very good book for getting people to think that way. And as part of that, you start bringing in many more different kinds of capital that you're trying to raise and increase in beyond just the dollars or the euros in the bank account, right? So these are intellectual capital, spiritual capital, social capital, material capital, financial capital, cultural experiential capital, all valuable things. You expand the notion of value to include all those things, and you turn every business and every family, every level, again, of the game into augmenting all these different forms of capital, or at least taking them into consideration, rather than focusing on simple things like, just dollars, things like that. So that's a very good book to move things that way. Again, it's a whole nother topic for a whole nother day, but it shows you how rules such as make the world more beautiful and don't make the world worse off need to be applied at every level of society or the world, which includes something like a business, right? Okay, one more rule of thumb that I've found is incredibly effective, maybe the most effective, as these other rules like make the world more beautiful, is to ask the question, what is the best story? And then to take the path that is the best story, okay? And there's something about asking that question that just cuts through issues. So at the level of my family, we apply this all the time. Again, it's one of the reasons we're here at Mission Top, because we are at a stage in life where we said, what should we do? We've kind of reached some of those horizons that we had aimed at before in the past. So what do we do from here? Or when we're confronted with a problem, like a conflict in the family, for instance, or some major problem. I mean, it could be a sickness, it could be anything, really. If you take the time to ask yourself, what would be the best story out of this? It nearly always will give you the right answer, the way to proceed. And that's because there's something about reality, again, that lays itself out fundamentally as a story. And then we all know the story patterns that are good stories, right? We'll only go see good stories. If we are in a movie and it's just a bad story, we'll turn it off. We'll say this isn't worth it, right? We have an inherent recognition of good story patterns. And so if you consider, not what is the easiest path or the most convenient path, but instead the best story, the story you would imagine wanting to tell your grandchildren sitting on their bed someday about what you did facing this situation, then that will almost always lead you rightly. And we'll almost always take in this holistic context as well, because good stories, ultimately don't end up degrading things that should not be degraded, right? And so that's a very powerful question and very powerful way of framing the world, and a great way, again, a great rule of thumb in a new metagame. All right, we're getting some good activity here on the chat. Thank you everyone for being here. I've really enjoyed seeing new names every day. Looks like my daughter was on here too and said hi. So hello, Corinne. Thank you for giving me little encouragements here on the chat. But Sigvard Bjorkman, I think that's a name I haven't seen here before. So welcome and glad to see you participating. And then some familiar names, Christian and Martin. I'm glad you could be here today as well. And I encourage anybody at all times on these streams to participate, to communicate with other people in the group. And as always, as I've said before, I love receiving your comments on any of these videos. So it doesn't have to be in the chat, it can be in comments. Also welcome your emails, because it is incredibly motivational to me to hear people's actual stories, because at the end of the day, this is about real life, real people. And the more that I can kind of connect with you as real people and see, your real concerns in life and your real situations, the more this all actually becomes motivational and meaningful. And I want to engage in it, because it's like having, it's actually making some sort of real difference in the world, which is always the drawback of these virtual spaces. Is it's hard to see if everything is just staying in that virtual world or if it's actually transmitting into the real world. So again, thank you for everyone in participating. And looks like Giant Enemy Rooster just jumped on too, so welcome, and we'll be getting to the chat as we go along. Okay, the next rule that we went over yesterday was respect complex systems. And I did a fairly good job at showing how something like the agricultural environment is a complex system, nature itself. But one thing I didn't mention is that you are a complex system, right? You're a whole world in there. And we talked about not trying to manipulate or control these kinds of systems. Well, the same goes for you. And if it goes for you, then it goes for your family, which is just this collection of complex systems all working together. These are the kind of things we don't try to manipulate, right? Human beings, natural systems. Even I've learned that here in this agricultural space at Mission Top, whether it's a flock of sheep or goats or pigs, when you start getting into compulsion, you might have to in little spaces, but it's almost always better to work with these natural systems. A flock of sheep is a very complex kind of social dynamic, and the more you work with it, with finding shared values and working with the motivations and the cares of these complex systems, these living systems, the better off things get. So yeah, you don't try to manipulate them, dominate them, you work with them as part of them. Oftentimes, you join with them and become part of those systems, and then work with it, never against it. Next rule was always preference bringing about states through persuasion and exchange, with compulsion only being used as a last resort. And that's basically what I just said. So you can see how these ones are related, but I spent a lot of time talking yesterday about this really applies to government, because government is inherently a system of compulsion, which sometimes has its role, right? But we should always be framing things in that way with government, and so doing things that require the least amount of compulsion, hence the least amount of government. But it doesn't just apply to government, of course, it applies at any level of these kind of things. So yeah, again, with yourself, try to compel yourself the least amount and work with the living systems inside of you. Works great at levels of family. I've noticed, my children do not like to be forced to do things. They very much like to be incentivized and have an exchange relationship in accomplishing things rather than coercion, or they want to be persuaded, not coerced. And it turns out almost everything living in the world seems to feel that way. Animals and living systems, even like a forest, I'm sure if you could communicate effectively with it, would tell you it doesn't want to be coerced into things, it wants to be persuaded, if you will. Okay, we talked about how I threw out there that I think we should be looking to live in extended family units, greater groupings of people rather than just the nuclear family. Just parents and children is not a big enough grouping to take care of and support kind of the fundamental needs of life that occur in life and taking care of each other. And if we were living more in extended family units and looking to take care of problems more in that kind of grouping, something like 50 people or below, or maybe a little bit bigger than that there'd be far more resources within a group like that to take care of so many more problems that we are just looking to government to take care of right now in very inefficient and expensive ways. Taking care of the elderly being one of those kinds of concerns. So I threw that out there. We also talked about revivifying the concept of love and living it out in a revivified way, about agape and philia and eros and the difference of those, and how we've degraded the term love today. We talked about how love is an attraction felt toward that which you value. So it doesn't do for anyone to just say, just love, love will save the day. No, you've got to specify, why should I love this thing? Why should it be of value? If love is this attraction and felt emotion towards something of value, you need to specify to me why that thing is worth valuing, why I should love it. It's not enough to just say, love is a many splendored thing. Love lifts us up, where we belong. All you need is love, right? As that Moulin Rouge song begins with. That's nothing. That's saying nothing right there. And we need more and more specificity with love. And and having done so, it cuts through so many situations, such as sex. Sex is tied up with love. So if you can see that, sexual love and erotic love is the union, of two things, making two things into one thing, that's a very powerful concept to teach your children the realities of sex, for example, right? Because you're teaching them, why would you want to join with something and become something worse off, right? So many kids just want to join. They want to engage in sex in order to have the pleasure of sex. But if you frame it and say, look, sex is eros, right? You are becoming one thing with this person. And why are you trying to join in this way that will mean nothing, that you become something worse than you were before? And if you frame it in this other way, why don't you look to join ultimately with something that you become something tremendously greater, both of you. The two things become something much grander and greater. And you'll see that isn't done so easily. And it isn't done in a flippant way. It takes planning, it takes conditions, it takes some definite, other types of love, agape, and philia within that, before you eros, you could say. So you see how if we start thinking in this way, revivified love, it cuts through so many issues. Okay, we talked about how mistakes are welcome and expected in this process of progress, but not tragic mistakes. And we talked about revivifying the word sin and just seeing it as, missing the mark, and how it takes away when you look at it that way, it takes away the disgust nature of cleanliness and purity language, which we've attached to sin. Yesterday I didn't do good enough at talking about avoiding tragic mistakes, though, because like in our family, we talk about how mistakes are welcome in our family. We're not going to get on you for making mistakes, or at least we try not to. We do get on each other a lot in our family, but we try not to, and we try to have constant forgiveness of those types of mistakes. But then there's the tragic mistakes, right? And the tragic mistakes are a different category that we talk about a lot in our family. And they're the ones that affect other people's lives in clearly negative ways. So take something like drug addiction. Any member of a family gets addicted to drugs, that's not only going to affect them, that's going to affect the entire family in very negative, ways that aren't just inherently tied into progress, like a lot of mistakes are. And you'll have to work very hard to ameliorate the pain that comes and try to turn it still into something positive. And it would be better if it was just avoided altogether. So tragic mistakes are the mistakes that are better avoided altogether. Divorce is another one of these. When somebody gets divorced, they don't realize it doesn't just affect them and their spouse. It affects so many more people. And their children, because you can't ever actually be divorced in this world, right? You will deal with that person and their family, and your children will deal with all of you forever. So, divorce is only one type of separation. In other ways, you are tied into this whole big, mass of people forever, and everybody suffers through that process. So that's another one that, that is something we teach our children. You definitely want to avoid. It's not so, the way that society has seen it, right? It's so disrespectful to what is going on and to other people, both into entering into these relationships and so casually exiting them with no fault. And, just anybody, if the love is gone, then exit the relationship, right? Again, topics for other times, but they just get to this point of teaching people that your tragic mistakes affect all of us, and those are the ones to avoid. And I think once people frame things that way and see themselves as affecting other people, that's big incentives not to enter into these types of mistakes, even though, of course, they'll continue to happen. All right, next, recognize the inevitability and necessity of hierarchy, but also that there is nothing better or worse about being at any place in the hierarchy. So this is around where we stopped yesterday, and this is one of those key things that we're dealing with right now in society that I think there's a way through. And it's, once again, by unifying the masculine and the feminine. The masculine being this vertical, hierarchical way of looking at the world, where things do have their place and there is higher and lower, gradations of things and places in society and even levels of capacity and capability, right? We want people with more capability higher in the hierarchy that deals with that kind of capability. And so hierarchies will exist, but then there's the feminine, more horizontal plane of things that says, in fact, there is still an equality in everything. And both of those things are true. There is not equality in the world, but there is another dimension in which there is equality. And so we have to start seeing, again, the world in those ways, taking both of those instead of one or the other, bringing them together and unifying them both at the same time. So one example of the kind of things the way we have to reconceptualize things is like in my family, we still see things in my family unit, we still see things in a hierarchical way. And I am the head of the family, right? I am, and even as the head, I am in a way higher than my wife in our family. But in saying that, first of all, we are both the head of the family, just like, we are like king and queen of the family. So we're both the head. We're very much like the yin-yang symbol, where I am the white part that has this way in which it's kind of above, and the black part is the feminine, and it's a little bit below, but it's unified as one thing. And even up at the highest part of the white part, the masculine part, there's part of the feminine there. And even at the lowest part of the feminine part, there's masculine there. And that's the kind of head that we are, like intertwined as the head, but I'm still the higher part, if you will, as a category. Does that mean I'm better? Does that mean I'm more important or even more powerful? In certain ways, yes, but in other ways, no. And here's a great example that came to me yesterday to hit that home, and the kind of examples we need to put out there into society, and that would be the game of chess, right? So, in one way, the king is the most important piece on the board, right? Because the whole identity of the team, you could say, the group, either the whites or the blacks, the whole identity is tied up in that king. So the king's very powerful in that way. But notice in other ways, the king is not powerful. The king can only move in these very constrained ways. It's very annoying the way that the king can move. Only in these set ways, and it's not very helpful. And guess what? A proper king acting is going to be operating in that way because, as it turns out, kings are always beholden to something higher than them, right? Divine, something divine above them, or it could be in the United States, even a president. If you could see the president like the king, they're beholden to something higher, which would be the body of laws and things like that. There's always something higher than what's at the head, and that they're beholden to, and in that, they are constrained in their motions in that. And so in chess, look at the queen, right? The queen doesn't have a certain kind of power that the king has, being the identity and the life of the whole being, you could say, the whole team of whites or blacks. But look at the more fluid and versatile movements of the queen. In many ways, the queen is the most useful piece on the board, and many would say the most powerful piece on the board. That's one way of framing it, right? In another way, the queen is the most powerful piece on the board, but it's different. It's a different kind of power. And so these are the kind of ways that we have to see both hierarchies, but also equalities in the world. There are hierarchies, but there's also equalities as to importance, as to powers, right? Even though the powers are different. And so this is one of those that we can't talk enough about. And you'll see that it just infuses everything I'm talking about, because I think it's one of the fundamental problems with society right now. Another thing to realize in these kind of hierarchies, that no matter where you are in the hierarchy, first of all, there's always something higher and always something lower than you, wherever you are. And so if you think it's better to be higher or lower, well, everybody has higher or lower. So that's where there's that equality again, that no matter where you are, you're always beholden to something higher. And then what should you do with what's lower? We'll get to this. You should be serving and that which is below you, okay? So everybody has that. But another thing is that all the highest sovereignties, the highest identities, right? Think of the identities that are given to us in religious and even governmental identities. What are the highest things throughout history? The prophet, the priest, the king, the chief, all those things, those kinds of identities. Before they resided all with the gods, right? Then we see certain rulers like the Pharaoh start to embody those types of highest identities. They become the god of the people in different ways. And over time, you start seeing humanity figure out that, all these identities actually can be lived out at the different gradations of society. So even like in the United States, there's this notion that the people are sovereign, even though they're lower in the hierarchy than something like, a senator or a member of Congress. But the people are yet have a sovereignty inherent to them. So this is something key about hierarchies, that no matter where you are in the hierarchy, you can exercise the sovereign roles. You can be king, prophet, priest, or whatever it may be at whatever level of the hierarchy you're at, okay? And then lastly in this hierarchy, so if you are lower, what should everybody be doing? What's appropriate to do no matter where you are in the hierarchy? The appropriate thing to do is to face, that which is higher than you. And the reason that's appropriate is because no matter where you are, like if you face towards that which is higher than you, that holds together the hierarchy itself and the group and the being, you could say, because again, our bodies are us as people are made up of the hierarchy, right? We naturally know what it is. You'd say the feet and things are kind of the lower part of the hierarchy. The head is the higher part of the hierarchy. It's even there embodied in our physical nature. But yeah, our minds are kind of the higher part of us. Our bodies are the lower part of us. And so what should everything do? What should the body even do? We have to unify it all up in the identity of the higher identity. And so, and each part of the lower part of the hierarchy can always embody that identity of the higher thing. And by doing that, become a cohesive unity, right? I'm just realizing I'm talking very abstractly about this. And I think I'm going to have to leave it abstractly or else we'll never get through this. But hopefully you're at least getting some of these principles that we'll talk about again and again. This is just the bare bones, summary of a lot of these things. But at least you can come out of here with the hope that there's a way of dealing with these hierarchies that is inevitable. You're in hierarchies all the time. We all are. And seeing that it's not about where you are in them. It's about what direction you're facing and what you're doing at your level of the hierarchy, the sovereignty you're embodying wherever you are. Okay, I'm going to stop there because that's definitely where we stopped yesterday. I'm going to look at some of your comments and then we'll jump into finishing this out, which I think has some of the most important things that should tie everything that we've talked about together much better. And in fact, you'll see that I've already been infusing it very much into what I've been talking about today. Okay, you said the book sounds interesting, holistic management. So yes, Martin, it is interesting, but it's also a book that's like very much targeted towards like the other big idea of the book is how to use rotational grazing and such as with sheep and cattle in order to raise more, to restore soil quality and grasslands and things in brittle environments, more arid, deserty environments in the world. And so it's a very strange book because that's like very much part of the focus, and yet he brings in this whole other holistic management thing that has come about as he's tried to solve this problem, because it was in looking at the world and systems as a whole that he came to a fundamental insight about how something like a whole environment turns more towards desert or more towards what he calls a non-brittle environment, which is kind of an environment you see much more in like the UK, where things grow and turn green and whatnot much more naturally and whatnot. So, and he makes a very good point that our world has turned much more towards the desert because of the ways, because of our actions, because of the ways that we've managed things and done grazing, and even his idea is that we let the earth, we've had this idea that if you just leave the earth alone, then it will turn better, right? But he's saying it's this holistic way of looking at things. He saw that that's not the truth. Actually, if you leave the place alone and put a fence around it, certain things can't happen that are tied into this complex system, such as grass needs to be grazed down and eaten and processed, and then manure put back into the ground in order for grass to grow back better later and cover more of the ground, which starts changing, again, water cycles and mineral cycles, which starts affecting the rain and the climate of a place, which then makes things, the whole growing environment of that place different. And if you just put a fence around it, like many national parks in the United States have done, saying, oh, this place is being degraded, just let it rest, the places haven't recovered. And so it's a very cool book because he's talking about that, and yet he's giving you this framework, this holistic framework that he's saying applies to business decisions and any level of life that you want to apply it to. So you have to go into it with the right expectations. So it's kind of a boring book per se, unless you see the value of the ideas behind it. So Giant Enemy Rooster says, I used to work for a small business just starting up, and oftentimes sustainability is the last thing on their mind. My bosses were nice people, but they were business-minded, focused on. Yeah, and that's the point. In the game we're playing right now as a society, this is not required. This is not part of the game. The main game is bottom line, make money. And the faith is that, through the invisible hand, if everybody acts selfishly, tries to make money, things work out better for everything. And in some ways it has. Like, we have to recognize that capitalism and this way of proceeding in the world has produced wealth, has produced human flourishing and tons of resources. I mean, we live opulent lives, right, in some ways. But because we weren't trained at thinking holistically, it has also degraded a lot of the world in ways that we're now, starting to have to reckon with and are regretting. So what's the solution? Well, again, I'm not seeking to abolish that kind of thinking, but just expand it, where you say, oh, actually money isn't the only form of capital. It's not the only value that we should care about that are tied into, our well-being. Money isn't the only thing tied into human well-being. We've got to consider these other things. And so, you get even businesses thinking that other way through this. Be in their own self-interest, though, not expecting them to make themselves worse off in the long run. But of course, it's always the long run. It's getting people to think to that long run. And we're going to get right into how do you do that? How do you get people to care in that way, right? Martin says, I assume you read Donald Miller. And I'm not sure, again, if he's talking to me or Giant Enemy Rooster, but I want to say I've read Donald Miller. That sounds familiar. I mean, you guys know I like to read, and if I haven't, I probably wanted to because it sounds familiar, but it's not sparking exactly what his ideas are. So maybe I haven't read that or read any of his books, but I'll check them out because I'm always looking for new ideas. Yes, Giant Enemy Rooster says the system right now makes it hard for new businesses to establish without kind of looking at it as just focusing entirely on the bottom line, and that's right. That's a problem that has to be dealt with and recognized, a reality that a new metagame has to address, right? Yes, that's okay. I have read Donald Miller then, Martin. So he says Donald Miller is the guy who writes about taking life as a story. Started a whole company about it called Story Brand. I think I have. I'll check it after this episode. But if I haven't, I've read a book, very much like that, which, yes, tries to get people to recognize the value of seeing your life as a story and yourself as a player in it. So, and at least the one that I read, I really liked. So that is, like I said, it's a powerful concept. Okay, I'm going to move on and jump in. So here's where we get into, answering a problem, which is, okay, this is all nice to say people should think holistically. We kind of all know that we should. Well, how do you get people to actually care enough to do it? Because the other thing that we have to recognize about the world is that there are huge incentives to act in what's good now at the sacrifice of what's good in the future, right? And that's always been the case, and it's taken some very hard conceptual work, I think, with humanity to see that if you're willing to sacrifice what's good now for something good later, it will turn out better for you, right? But there's still the problem that so often we fall into the short-term thinking or the narrow-minded thinking, because oftentimes it's not short-term, it's more the narrow or constrained kind of thinking of ourselves just as individuals and what's good for us as an individual or just as a family or just as a business rather than the bigger conception. Because once you draw in the bigger conceptions, then it's easier to think in that long-term way. So how do we do that? Well, one is to start from the very earliest ages to get people good at living and conceptualizing themselves at all levels of being simultaneously and all identities simultaneously. Okay, so our society kind of incentivizes us to think of ourselves as individuals primarily, right? Especially the United States has been all about individualism and the heroism of the individual and these kind of things. And movies are all the time, celebrating that individual, the different person, the underdog, and their individual striving, through things. And so, for good reason. I mean, it is good to think of yourselves as an individual to a degree. And that's probably also something that we've had to work very hard at as societies to come to this viewing individuals, as egos, as important at the individual level. Because if you don't see people as individuals, then they're expendable, right? It's okay to kill them or do whatever you please with them for the betterment of a group or a society. And so this has been a key thing that's been good to develop, but then we focus too much on that and we lose the other levels of being. So when I'm talking about living at all levels of being simultaneously, we have to be able to jump our attention. We can't oftentimes do it all at once. We have to kind of jump around, but we jump our attention from thinking of ourselves as an individual to thinking of ourselves as a family being, thinking of ourselves as a community being, as a being in a body and like a religious body, and a body of a city, and the body or being of a country, but our body as a being in an ecological system. And ultimately, it all scales up to the body of human beings at large, so all of humanity, but also see ourselves as part of this ecological being of the earth, Mother Earth itself. And then you can keep on going, right? This universe is a pretty big place, it turns out. And so you can go all the way out there and see that you are a thing at every level of those beings. You are the earth itself, right? But you also are an individual. But then you go down into yourself, right? And see that, actually I'm lots of things. I'm all these different systems, these body systems, these passions. I've got my microbiome. I've got this passion for food that's kind of, seems to be centered around the gut and things like that. I've got my spirit. I've got my, you start realizing that you are this, world in and of yourself. And if we can start doing this, and I think the only way to do it is to start teaching it to our children and doing it again ourselves, then you can start caring at these different levels of being, okay? So one more example, just to make sure we've hit this topic home of how you can start doing this. Here's an exercise you can do to start getting yourself being able to do this. You just look at a chair. This is the example Jonathan Pajot always uses, so I'm stealing his example. You look at a chair, and we say, that's one thing. There it is. It's a chair, okay? But now reconsider it. This will get your mind good at this. Reconsider. It's not just a chair. It's actually a collection of parts of a chair. So we've got the back, we've got each individual leg, there's different pieces of wood there, but you can keep on going as far as parts. How many parts are there actually in a chair? You start counting them. Okay, yeah, back, leg, thing. Okay, there's about 10 parts to that chair. You say, really? Like, what about, maybe there's 2 different types of materials in that chair? Oh yeah, there are 2 different types of materials. And then is that piece of wood, is that all just one thing? And you start looking at it and, oh, it came from one thing, but yeah, clearly there's different parts of this wood. There's different rings within the wood, for example, and you just keep on going with that. Pretty soon you're down at this, the atomic level. Oh, what are the different elements that comprise this chair? And you get all this way down, if you want to the quantum level, and you're talking about, probability fields or all that. And you see, in essence, that this chair that you thought was one thing is actually infinite things. Because not only if you get down to some fundamental particle, that's not the baseline, because now all those different individual things could be grouped in any different way that you want to, right? So it's not just there's a back of the chair and each individual leg, but you could say, well, there's the top part of the chair and there's the bottom part of the chair. Those are 2 different parts, right? And again, you can classify that chair into infinite things, but then you can go up from that chair and you say, oh, actually this chair, it's not just a chair, it's part of a dining set that I have in my house. So it's actually part of a bigger thing. And then this dining set is actually part of a certain style of dining sets that can all be classified into a thing. And then I guess since it's here at Mission Top, this chair is really just part of Mission Top. So it's really just Mission Top. And you can go all the way out. Actually, it's a part of the Earth. It's part of the things that comprise planet Earth. So this chair is not a chair, it's part of planet Earth. And then, you go. So again, I try to take you through that exercise because it's important. By being able to do that to anything, something like a chair, well, then you can start doing that to yourself. And if you can do that to yourself, you can do that to other living things and different groupings that we have. And you start to realize that this is the way that our minds work. We have this ability to pick out things in the world, in this giant field of potentiality that could be classified in any given way. We have this ability that's often been tied into this notion of the Logos. It's been tied into Christ and Christianity, of unifying the pattern of something with the earthly reality, materiality of something to see a certain thing in the world. But once you have seen that and formed that in your mind and you see that thing, you can break it down into infinite things. And once you see that we have this power to create and break down and create and break down, you can start being able to do this with the way that you conceive yourself in the world. And you can start seeing yourself that, I am an individual, but I'm also many things. But I am my family. There's no different between me and my children and my wife. There's some space between us, but there's space between all the things in my body too, especially down at the atomic level. There's all sorts of space in me. And so I'm one thing, our family is one thing. We're one being, we're a living, breathing being. We have a body, we have a soul, and I am not just I am this family. And then you go do it at the next level. So what's the value of doing that? Well, once you can see that you're these different levels of self that you are, then you can start caring about those different levels of self because they're you, right? You care about the ecological systems around you because you are that ecological system. And what happens to that ecological system happens to you. You are part of it. If it gets hurt, you will be hurt. And so at a very practical level, this is what we do with our family in our house. Like, our children are quarreling all the time and oftentimes doing things, malicious things, right, that hurt the different members of the family. I mean, they will consciously, sabotage the life of some other member of the family, just as we see in society. That's why, again, my family is such a nice little laboratory, because we get to try out ideas of how to ameliorate these things. Well, one of the most potent ideas we have that we have to introduce again and again is telling our children, like, you think you're hurting somebody else there by hurting your brother or sister, right? But in fact, it's not the case. You are hurting yourself. Like, And we use the concept of a team, of a sports team. Like, why would you sabotage your own sports team? That's a very good way to see this, because a sports team, you can see how it's a grouping, it's a togetherness, it's one thing. You are the Fighting Eagles of that sports team, right? You are one thing. So why would you sabotage yourself? That doesn't make sense. And so the more, if we can get our kids to move their thinking into that level of being, then it's much easier, to not sabotage yourself, to care about yourself, because you are part of this, right? And then you go up from there. It's nice here at Mission Top because we have like these animals. These animals are part of Mission Top. And so we can tell our kids, like, you should care about those animals because they're you. You are Mission Top, they are Mission Top, so you should care about them. And what's another word for care? Love, of course, right? There's the kind of loves that we want. There is an eros here. You are part of one body, and so what happens to them affects you, and what happens to you affects them. They even help you to sense as a body. Like, I've noticed these animals, they perceive things in the world that I wouldn't have noticed, but now that I'm there seeing them as part of my body, they enhance my perceptions, right? My dogs enhance my perceptions. My sheep enhance my perceptions. As funny as that sounds, it works, right? And so as we start doing these kinds of practices, you see yourself as these different parts of the world, it makes solving conflict in the world just a lot more realistic. But I'm not pretending this is easy. This is something that has to be trained in us. We have the ability as humans. It's so cool what we can do, right? We can think of ourselves like from a removed position, right? From kind of see ourselves sitting there in the world. And then we can think of ourselves thinking, okay? But see what's even cooler, we can think about ourselves thinking about ourselves thinking, right? Try that. Think about yourself thinking about yourself thinking. And you can go, you can't go too much beyond that, but it's very cool the way that these are the abilities we have as humans that it doesn't seem like other living creatures have that make us what we are. And it's also the solution to this problem we have right now, where we live in this pluralistic world of all infinite sorts of divisions and cultures and whatnot. But we do have the ability, if it's trained, to jump into these different levels of being around us. So I've hit on this because it's so important. And one of those things that, of course, we're all imperfect at it, but again, it can be trained. There are practices in the world that have existed to do just this. The Stoics had one called the view from above, which was in a different way kind of doing what I did with you on the chair. You can look it up. There's probably a good YouTube video that takes you through the view from above, okay? And so if we can reach this, if we can start teaching this to our children, if we can start doing it to ourselves, and at least those who care about this, start living this rule, I want you to notice if it makes your life better, if it enhances your life. And I would dare to say that it will. One very cool thing about this is that it gives you the means to resolve conflict at any level around you. So, we look at something like, the Middle East, the conflicts there, and we say, they're unsolvable conflicts, they can never be solved. And I'm not pretending I have like the secret to solve the Middle East conflict, but when those similar kind of things happen at your level of life, let's say it's within your community and there's some division within your community. Well, the thing you can always do, if you're effective at this, is to get people to say, wait a second, like, first what we need to do is zoom back one level of being here until we see that actually we thought we were two fighting things, we're actually one thing, okay? And if you can get people to even start to do that, to see themselves, oh, yeah, okay, we are one community, and then do we all care about this community? We want it to be the best it can. Oh, okay, yeah. So then right there you're starting on a level of being that you now share. And it's at that level that you can then work it through persuasion, negotiation, exchange, and trade to find the ways that, because I think there's always a way to get the division, the separate things, to both benefit within the thing that they're together on, okay? So this is where, I think the best way to explain this is like in your body. right? All of us have these conflicting passions and spirits oftentimes. I have it every time that I drive past the local McDonald's when it's hungry. I have one part of me that says, like, I don't want to go there. I don't like McDonald's. It makes me feel gross. And then there's this other part of me that says, yeah, but it feels really good in the moment, right? And you need some of that, and it's really cheap. Look, they've got like this special going on. You don't want to miss out on that. And so those parts of me fight, and how do you get those to resolve? Well, you have to get them to both be in the pursuit of something higher, right? And so how would you do that with your body, right? You have to say what is something that is good for all parts of the body, like simultaneously. That would be something like health, and say, okay, yeah, there's a time that in pursuit of health, we can satisfy that part of us that craves things. And there's a time, to hold off on things. So how about we find some way to satisfy this craving, this appetite, in a way that achieves the health of all of us in the body, right? And so maybe you find a different thing to eat right then at the store that wasn't the McDonald's, but isn't just going without and making that part of that craving part of you have to suffer. And so that's just one small example of how, again, you have to find there's always some higher level of being at which you can get things to have a common vision, and then you negotiate. You can get good at negotiating with yourself to achieve that kind of thing. I'm just noticing my camera's getting overblown because the light is changing, so I'm going to adjust that real quick while you can kind of digest what we've been talking about. All right, hopefully that's a little bit better. Again, this is a fundamental skill, one that would just in and of itself kind of change the way that people experience the world if we were good at doing it ourselves and training our children to do it. So let's move on to the next related idea with this that's just as important and works very much the same, so hopefully I'll spend less time on it, which is we learn to not just think of time as locked into the present. We think we're in the arrow of time, we're always stuck in this present moment, but in fact I would argue that we're not stuck in the present, especially as to what matters. If you can see the way that in talking about the chair, that we have this ability with our consciousness to form different things at different levels. We essentially create the world, because you see our ability to do this reshapes the world around us in any moment. The way that we have the ability to form a thing into one thing at one moment and another thing into another moment. So for example, going back to the chair, normally when I've got a chair there in my house, it's a chair and I can sit on it. And so that's what it is. It has this function of something to sit on. But if I were there in my house late at night and a bear broke into my house, which is always a possibility here, that chair would no longer be something to sit on. And in an instant, my mind could turn it into something, to a projectile to throw across the room at the bear while I tried to, get away from it. And so it would cease to be a chair right then. It would become a projectile. In an instant, my mind changed it. The meaning of that chair changed, right? So we create the world according to meaning, is my argument with that. And if you realize that, well, the same thing works at the level of time. So although we can't go back and change the physical events of the past, right, at any given time we can go back into the past and change its meaning. And if meaning is what makes up the world far more than the matter of the world, then it is the meaning, the fundamental thing that the world's made of, can always be changed. Meaning the past can always be reconceptualized as to its meaning. And if that's true, then the future can always be reconceptualized as to its meaning. And once you realize that you can live in the past and the future, and you can do it simultaneously, you can jump around, and you can affect the future right now, and you can affect the past as to its meaning right now. And you can turn the future, into whatever meaning that you want it to have by, if the future is a field of potentiality in that way, and you can craft it into whatever you can conceive of it being by operating in the present, then yeah, you can start seeing how we should be able to constantly have the future and the past present to us and jump around in those as we seem fit. So once you can do that, how does that affect your life, like in a tangible way? Well, one thing I would say is that you can redeem your ancestors. And this is very important because you'll notice that you are your ancestors in a way. So this is another level of being. You are comprised of the information and the identities of your ancestors, the ones that were able successfully enough to reproduce and pass it on to you. So you're made up of the survivors of the past. And how many people? You're endless amounts of these ancestors, and they comprise you, right? You are part of them as well. Well, as you look to the past, all of us have certain ancestors that to learn about them spurs us on, and they have the stories that give our family these helpful identities, help us to move towards some ideal that we want to move towards. But then all of us have these ancestors back behind us that have some sort of story or tragedy, right, that degrades who we are, that makes our lives difficult. So I'm going to do a whole video on this. I'm going to use the movie Coco to make an example of this, where you see that because of the story of an ancestor, it affected the whole family's future. Instead of being musicians, they were shoemakers, right? And so if you learn that you can live in the past, you can actually go back there, and what can you do? You can change the meaning of those kinds of things in the past. So if you have one of these stories that is constantly degrading your family in the present, the more you go back and you learn about that story, learn about the factors, learn about the players and the decisions made, the more you automatically redeem that story, okay? You start learning from it, from one thing. And so even a tragic story learned about, as you dig back there into the past, reconceptualized, can be something that helps your family to be a better family in the future, okay? And then you also find plenty of those ancestors that do have these incredible stories of survival and overcoming things that just so naturally spur you on too. So by digging back there and living in the past, you redeem your ancestors from many of their tragic mistakes, and you turn them essentially into gods, is the only way that I can see it. You turn them into the things that turn you towards God, towards your ideal. And so if you look at religions, that's what happens a lot of times to the ancestors, right? They turn essentially into a part of God. Like Mulan at the beginning, she's there in this kind of hall of her ancestors, and they've all been turned into these forces and these gods that motivate her and push her on to better things. Okay, so if you can do that, well now let's do an exercise into the future. And this one's called the children's fire. Okay, it's an idea that I was just introduced to in a class recently on permaculture. And the idea behind the children's fire, it comes from a story. I don't even know if it's a factual story or not. It doesn't matter because it's a good story. And it's about a group of native peoples sitting around a fire, and they come to the conclusion that in order to make the world go right, they need to think about what they call the children's fire. And it's a principle that they come up with. It's a rule. So here's a rule tied into this, and that was that no law, no decision, no action, nothing of any kind will be permitted to go out from this council of chiefs that will harm the children, okay? And so you can see this is very much tied into those previous rules about making the world more beautiful, not harming the world. But you see how this one's placed in a context of time and in a future, because many children are here, but they're also the children unborn, the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren. If you start to live in that way, caring, communing with your yet unborn children. Like if I can start communing with my grandchildren now and creating the world that will make sure not to harm them, then already, again, I'm communing with them, I'm caring about them, even though they're in the future, right? And as I implement this principle of the children's fire, I turn the future and those grandchildren into the grandchildren and living in the world that I want them to have. And I also raise my children in such a way that it turns into the posterity that have the principles and the culture that I want them to have, okay? So the essence of all this, that we've taken time on now, is to present this idea that not only do we have to be able to live at different levels of being, we have to be able to live at different levels to transcend time, as it were, and start living simultaneously in the past, redeeming it, in the future, shaping it, communing with the future and shaping it into what it should be, and not creating anything of harm into the future, and doing that by operating constantly, in the moment, in the present. Okay, these are concepts that I don't know how they're received to you. You can let me know, but they're the kind of things that I'm pretty confident that if we could begin to think this way, definitely the world starts turning into a very different place than the world that we have now with the game that we're playing. Okay, next thing. Next rule, recognize the reciprocal covenant nature of the world. Interact with others in ways that mutually benefit each of you, but don't keep score. Okay, so I've used the word covenant, which I really like because it has the nature of a kind of weighty or even sacred promising between parties. But if you're not familiar with the word covenant, replace it with something like trade or exchange. So recognize the trade or exchange nature of the world. There's something very cool about the universe as it's structured, and that is that there are ways in which, people, it's almost magical, that both people can give up something they value less for something they value more. And so both parties can start with something lesser and end up with something greater. And again, by like the laws of thermodynamics and things like that wouldn't seem possible, right? But somehow it is. Through the structure of the universe, especially with living beings, there's this capacity to trade or exchange or covenant such that both parties end up better off. And if you start to believe in that, in the sense that you act it out, you start to have this faith in this. And that's kind of one of my fundamental faiths in life, is that no matter what the situation, there's always a way to make both people better off. Like, I don't believe in altruism or self-sacrifice in the sense that you make yourself worse off in order to make other people's better off, okay? Like, I don't think that's ever how it actually works out. It's nice because you need to that's the first step, right? But you always have to, the godly way of looking at it is to see the whole picture. And the whole picture always is that sacrifice only ever makes sense if you're giving up something that makes you worse off in the short term for something better later. And in an exchange with another person, both sides can be doing that simultaneously and both work out for the better. So this is one of those things that, I love about the structure of the world, because I think it's always present. And so that is how I look to solve any sort of problem, is to look and say, let's keep on working on this, digging into this until we can find the way that everyone benefits out of this. Because who wants to be left hurt out of any situation fundamentally? No one, okay? So if we all had that kind of faith, then you can see, like, the world does not solve its problems this way. We have reverted to political solutions, most of all, and that's just one side forcing the other to conform to some behavior. And then the other side gains control, and they try to force the other side to some behavior. And so this is one of those rules that, again, changes the nature of the way that we experience the world right now. Okay? Next rule, harmonize yourself with the pattern of death and rebirth. Don't fight against it. So as we look into reality and the way that it operates, there is this ever-recurring cycle, right, of death and rebirth, of creation and then disintegration. Okay, it happens with our bodies, it happens with the living environment, it happens to ideas and structures. Things are created, they hold themselves together, eventually they degrade in some way, and unless they're recreated, they will fall apart and die. Okay, so again, this happens to patterns, structures, living things, non-living things like a building, right? So almost every level of being, this pattern takes place in the world, one of creation and disintegration. So instead of trying to fight against that kind of pattern, you start embracing it. You start realizing, okay, if this pattern is always recurring, well, maybe I can help, channel it in the ways that are helpful rather than hurtful. And because if it will happen anyway, so let's say like if your life is going great and everything's just peachy and it's nice and ordered, your life is you have created your life into something just beautiful and peaceful and everything's great. Well, if you are cognizant of this pattern, you should realize that something eventually will come and disintegrate your life or cause at least part of it to fall, to come apart, if you will. And a lot of people just kind of let those things happen a lot of times. And when that happens, naturally, you can't predict the ways that it's going to happen, right? So instead, what you can do is to realizing this pattern is going to happen anyway, you can be the force that actually chooses how it's going to fall apart. So I use the example of like my family, the way that we kind of structured our life and it came together and it was a nice life. We had all the needs we had the money we needed, we had a house, we had each other. It was great, right? But it was also very boring. And if we would have just kind of continued on there, not honoring this pattern, either one, something would have come along unexpected and knocked us, caused things to fall apart anyway, or it would have just stayed static. If things stay static, they're not growing. So realize this is tied into a pattern of growth. So instead, what we did is say, okay, let's choose the way that we're going to disintegrate this. And that's where we said, okay, the best possible story we can imagine, the best possible way of disintegrating this and forming it into something else would be we want to travel for a year. And so we worked very hard. It took a long time to make that a possibility. And we had to all come out of that pattern of our life that we had formed and reform it into something else, living somewhere else in that way. But in doing so, we kind of chose, we shaped the way in which we were going to grow. And maybe you can say kind of tried to bring God, our ideals into the process and moved ourselves toward that ideal by the breakdown and a reintegration, okay? So the point of this is to realize that since that's going to happen anyway in life, you can kind of start working with that pattern and bringing it about in ways where you have something, you essentially choose your problems. You get to the point in life where you can start choosing your problems rather than because problems, they can be bad, but they can also be good too. And they can be what spurs us to growth. So you start choosing the problems that will most lead you to growth rather than just letting the problems of the world come upon you, which they inevitably will. And of course, in some ways, you can't control all the ways this is going to happen. Tomorrow, a member of my family could get cancer and their body could eventually disintegrate, die, and back in the earth, and their body's gone, and I wouldn't have been able to prevent it, right? There's always those kinds of forces operating, so you have to respect that. And that's another thing of harmonizing yourself, preparing for the fact that all things eventually will die and need to be renewed, okay? So this is the last of kind of the core central rules that I have as part of this. I have a few more that are just kind of lesser rules that we kind of use as a coda or a wrapping up of things here. But more than anything, this is the most important part of the presentation that's finished now. In case anyone needs to go or anything like that, the other rules, I think they're good rules, but I just want to give you, kind of make this a natural kind of pause point. I'm going to look at the chat, see what you guys have been saying, and then be able to just kind of wrap this up. Okay, Giant Enemy Rooster. What if you have really, really low self-esteem? Okay, good point. Self-esteem. I'm going to think about that one because I think the danger is I could try to say something and it wouldn't be that helpful. I'd rather think about it and try to integrate that back into future things that I say. So I'm going to, pause off from trying to say something helpful on that and not knowing if I will, and make sure that I have something helpful to say about that in the future. Martin was saying this is so me with McDonald's. Yeah, if it's not McDonald's, it's something else, because our world has gotten so good, right? There are people in white lab coats like working to design, the perfect tastes and things like that to just seduce us into eating certain things. Just like people are designing apps and using algorithms to, through a statistical process, hone down to the exact things that will titillate our, these different passions within us. So this is a very difficult world to live in, which is why if it's not McDonald's literally, there are McDonald's everywhere. The comedian, what's his name? Oh, which comedian? Of course, his name has just jumped me, but it has a great segment on how there's so many of these different kinds of McDonald's in the world, and everybody has their McDonald's that they are susceptible to. So yes, it's an important part to realize. Obviously, pornography is a great example of another kind of McDonald's. John Amy Rooster says, could I ask, what is your framework for dealing with suffering as it pertains to viewing all parts of a whole? Suffering. I think, again, wanting to say something helpful. For sure, one of the fundamental things I do with suffering is, again, not try to fight it or suppress it. Sometimes suffering can be a good thing, right? But once you start realizing that you are in control of the meaning of life, that suffering is inevitable in life, in essence, but you control the meaning of life. It's almost like you can channel that suffering. If you can turn that suffering towards something higher, in essence, then the suffering becomes tied into meaning. So meaningless suffering, man, that's tough stuff. But suffering that is directed towards something else, higher, and a higher growth, well, then that suffering becomes something different. It becomes almost like sacrifice, right? So, again, I'm struggling with this because I think there's a better way to frame it, but that's what I have to say about it now. And again, that's another thing that I'm going to think about and try to have a better answer to, because that is some of the problems that have to be integrated into something like a metagame, because suffering will happen, and yeah, I think that's all I have to say about that right now. Okay, John Enemy Rooster reminds me of an Onion article, fake news, advertisers rush to exploit newly discovered flaw in human psychology. Yeah, and it's not even fake news. I mean, that's what people are doing constantly, so. Martin, we can theoretically, with the power of our intellect and will, give different meaning to our past. However, I found it to be a rather difficult, if not impossible task, especially when dealing with past relationships. So, I mean, it's good to recognize it is not easy. For sure, because in essence, it comes into this process. Things have to be dissolved. You have to break down something, a past meaning that was not helpful, and these are skills that take time to be able to do. You have to maybe start with easier things before dealing with those past things in your past that are difficult. You have to be able to break it down as to its previous meaning, and then form it into something that has a higher meaning, right? And I have things like that in my past. I mean, things that I've done. My wife is always kind of jabbing me because I forget a lot of things in life, and our memories aren't made to remember every detail. They're made to remember what matters. And I have to say, sorry, I guess I didn't think that thing mattered that you thought mattered, because I've forgotten it. So she's always jabbing me. But there's certain things, certain things I did in high school, for instance. They've stayed with me and they sting. They still hurt there, and I've had to really try to learn what I was up to when I did that thing, and really try to appreciate, where I was at that moment, why I did what I did, but then realize also like that being that did that is there in the past and has in essence, grown to a different being, me today. And so I have to be able to kind of learn from what was going on there and appreciate, what I've become or whatnot in order to get that to stop stinging so much, that thing in the past. So yeah, it's an example of how these things don't happen easily and they require effort, but at least there, I realize that it's possible. I go back there into the past and try to break down the thing that hurts in a way that's not helpful, and then reframe it into something that is. So not easy, but possible, and something that we have to practice at, a skill to develop. Hi, being aware that I am in front of a need to disintegrate my current life to start a new impulse towards growth and development, already in standstill, how can I assure that I will do it right? Again, I think my answer would be practicing with lower stakes things and getting good with it before you completely disintegrate something that you don't know you can handle the disintegration of. Because every time you disintegrate something, that's a death, right? And death comes with pain and with chaos. And you have to know that you can handle the putting things back together. So, something like a job, you're stuck into this framework of a job that you hate, and you want to make sure that you're doing this responsibly. Well, that's where it'd be awfully nice if maybe before you quit your job, you have either saved up a nice runway of savings in order to create something else, and that's what I'm in right now, trying to do. Or you have to have the new job lined up before you quit your job or something like that. Or maybe you are confident that for sure, if you quit your job and break down that framework, you'll be able to create the new framework and you can go for it. I'm not saying you have to always be 100% in a mode of security, because life does take risk, right? And learning from it. But you can kind of use that as a principle to not break down things yet that you're not confident you can handle. So look around for the things you can break down, whether it's a smaller habit or something like that in your life that you can break down and replace with something else, and get good at this process. Build your confidence in your ability to handle the inevitable chaos that comes with choosing to break something down and create something new. Okay, Giant Enemy Rooster brings up the point that, these disintegrations have to happen many times in life. Every day could be a new beginning. Framing it this way allows you room to make mistakes because you have more chances to fix it. So that's one thing too, is to, again, realize that sometimes when you do this, it won't work out, right? That's sin. You aimed at something, you were trying to break something down, aiming for a better life, and things got worse, right? Well, again, welcome to sin, welcome to this process of making mistakes. And so what do you do at that point? You reorient and you head towards the new thing. And you take joy in the benefits of knowing that you're in the process, right? That's something that I was trying to hit at the beginning. Not to say that doesn't still come with, pain and things like that. This isn't just some fanciful notion of everything's just great when this life is difficult no matter how you look at it. But at least you can realize that if you're in this process, that is the most important thing to a meaningful life, not getting things perfect every time. Okay, so let me go back. Let me go through just very quickly some of these other rules just for you to chew on, and then we'll wrap it up. So one is an idea, and this is just an idea at this point, it's not necessarily even a rule, is that we move the city to the virtual space to allow for the benefits of the city without the ecological drawbacks, okay? So society and human species has definitely benefited from the city in the way that it gets so many people close, in ways they can network, create new ideas, create new possibilities together. And certainly cities have been part of how humans have flourished and become, the force that we are on this planet. But I don't have to tell you, for anyone that lives in a city, that we've also done some, terrible things through the cities. We've We've created concrete landscapes that aren't beautiful. We've made it so people can isolate themselves and be essentially invisible in a city to others. We've made it so that people are detached from core processes of life, such as producing food, cooking food, making food, being tied into nature more. And so Jordan Hall is working on this idea called the civium, where part of it is this idea that perhaps now we've reached the point where we have the technology we can use to move the benefits of the city to the virtual space, where we can enjoy the benefits of that kind of collaboration and networking and joining of ideas, but don't have the ecological drawbacks of having to live in these spaces that oftentimes are not life-bearing spaces, and instead live more in the ways that we should while still retaining the ability to connect. So there's an idea to chew on, not necessarily a rule at this point. Next one is promote a basic value of self-sufficiency in everyone, coupled with the value that recognizes that some are going to be unable to be completely self-sufficient. This rule has been in part of society's game in a lot of places. The United States have had its times where there's especially rural environments where people have a pride in self-sufficiency while realizing that none of us are ever completely self-sufficient. And so this is something that in a new metagame is just a nice baseline principle that you teach your kids, but we've lost. We've lost out there in the general metagame, so it's got to be put back. So I think you'll notice kind of the benefits of that rule, and it's not worth spending 10 minutes on. Next one is to seek to balance the balance of efficiency and resiliency. Okay, and this is another way of looking at just having the right kind of union and balance between the masculine and the feminine, because masculine is more about efficiency, feminine about resiliency, right? And this one should be glaringly obvious to us in the face of COVID, the way that we were able to see that our society, the normal game, which focused much too much on efficiency, the masculine, was kind of, we were exposed to how we lacked resiliency in the way in our food supply, and even be able to get toilet paper to people and things like that, the crazy things that happen. That was a wake-up call to me, especially. It changed many of the ways that I'm looking at life. And so it just made me realize that there's always this balance between the two. Efficiencies are important, so are resiliencies. So again, you have to be willing to transfer your mind to both, evaluate both all the time, jump between those. Okay. All right, so those were the kind of the extra rules I had. And now in summing up, I wanted to kind of bring things back to, I said, in developing a new metagame, there's certain attributes that would be good to have in the new metagame. And some of them were such that everybody could play it, right? And everybody could win at the metagame. And in fact, that if anybody was doing good at the metagame, not only would they benefit, but everybody would benefit. Okay? So I'm hoping that you can see that if these were the rules that we started to play the new game by, that they're built in such a way because of these realities, such as the reciprocal nature of reality in which two parties can benefit and things, that it is possible that everybody could play this game simultaneously and everybody could win the same rewards. There's this non-rivalrous nature to this game because the game is focused in producing essentially value for others. This is very much like manhood. The best way, like if you've been listening to the manhood videos, think of it this way. You see how with manhood, you get everybody playing this game, that the more people play it well, the more everybody benefits, right? And so if that's possible in a space such as the institution of manhood, then we can arrange things in society such that it's the same thing. And so, yeah, for anybody to do well at it doesn't diminish anybody else's ability to also do well at it. I guess you could even say with manhood, it does still have a little bit of that rivalrous nature because it is competitive in a sense. There still is kind of a hierarchy in manhood, but in this game, there isn't. Because if it's about a process rather than an end goal, everyone can be in that process. And there's very good evidence, whether just experiential or scientific, that when people are in certain processes of moving towards a meaningful goal and they feel like they're genuinely making progress in that, the rewards are tremendous, and those are kind of rewards that aren't diminished by somebody experiencing them, right? So to get everybody in the way, like I talk about, and moving towards this higher ideal, and to get everybody using these patterns of reciprocation, covenanting, of these ways of exchange relationships, then we get things into self-reinforcing cycles where everybody can experience the rewards, and as anyone succeeds, it actually moves the cycle even faster. So it becomes something, hopefully exponential, right? And here's where you could get all excited about it. Like I think, what if we actually did do this as humanity? Not even all of us, but maybe half of humanity played by these rules for 50 years. Like, what would happen in the world? I mean, it really would be like, I don't know if we transcend, the way that we experience life itself. Like, I don't know what would happen, but for sure it would be interesting, right? I'd want to be part of that process. So it's pretty excited in that way to think about. But then, of course, you got to come back to the realities of things and realize that all these things are difficult. And the best we can do is to start trying them out in our own life imperfectly and better develop the rules and part of this game, but enjoy the rewards that come from it at the same time. So I wanted to make sure to do that recap. I'm going to end by putting out the problems that will already inevitably exist from this, just so that we can get thinking about them, and brief ideas on solutions. So one is the margin, the problems of the margin. There's always going to be things that don't fit into this conception in the way that I lay out. Okay? And this is what the world has been focusing on for so long. We've started noticing there's always people and things that don't fit into the general game that's going on in society. And so what we've done is we've started focusing on all these things that don't belong, all the identities that don't fit, and saying, let's just take that thing that doesn't fit and we'll bring it in and make it fit. But in that process, whenever you do that, whenever you take what doesn't fit and try to make it part of what fits, you automatically change what the whole game and the whole central rules of the game itself. Okay, so one example is that we've been talking tons about masculine and feminine, men and women, and things like that. And you see they're effective categories. We experience them, they're definitely there. But then you can point to an example. You could say, well, there's hermaphrodites. There's people that don't easily fall into masculine or feminine, or men or women. And so look, let's look at this. Let's focus on this, and let's see how we can make this let's bring it in and reframe everything according to this. And if you do that, notice how if you focus too much on the existence of hermaphrodites, then the main categories start to be shaken, as if they're not good categories, they don't exist, right? And so as far as I can tell, the reality of things is that there will always be things that don't exist. That's part of reality too, is that you can't ever account for everything. There's always going to be a margin, a remainder, a leftover, people that don't fit, and people living at the margins of categories that aren't quite one or the other, and that's okay, right? So this is part of the solution. Instead of saying, let's try to bring them into the center and design society around these people, usually they don't even want to be there. They want to be left at the margin. This is like Shrek. I think it's a great example of Shrek at the beginning of that movie. He's out in the swamp. He knows he's a marginal character, and he wants to stay there. But it was the king, trying to get rid of all the marginal characters that put that whole story into motion, and eventually ended up with this inverted world where Shrek is being made the king, if I remember right. So instead of that, I actually think people at the margins generally, it's not that they don't want to be denigrated, right? They don't want to be mistreated, but they're generally okay at staying in the margins too, right? If they're let's say, cared about, loved, if you will, there at the margins and seen as having a useful place. And one of the examples that I love that just kind of shows that this is part of the world is European cathedrals, the old cathedrals, where out there on the edges of the building, so if you see a cathedral in Europe, if you see it, that what it's trying to portray to you is the reality, the whole world, and the way that the world is. And always on the outside of the cathedral, or not always, but very often, there's these weird figures. There's monsters, there's gargoyles. When I was in Germany with my family, there's this one in, I believe in Freiburg, Germany, where there's these like, I can't remember if they're kind of elvish kind of people or little guys playing trumpets, but like there was literally like one where this guy is playing a trumpet out of his butt, and the water flows out of those, and you're just like, what the heck is this doing on a cathedral? Like what is this? And the more you look at it, you find that this is very common on buildings, which used to be trying to convey reality. It's common in medieval books that had these things called marginalia, where you'd have the text, maybe some sacred text or special text, and then out there on the margins there'd be like these animal-headed people, and butt trumpets and people teasing each other and doing lewd things and whatnot, because it's there at the margin, right? That's where it belongs. And so that's one thing that I think has to be put into this is you just accept from the beginning there will be things that don't belong. But maybe there's a value in that. Out there in the margin and the things that don't belong, there's new possibility. The world's always changing. Maybe there's things going on out there that could be part of a solution as the world changes and you have to reconceptualize the main categories. There might be some good ideas out there. And then there's this notion that Jonathan Pajot really points out well with Guardians of the Galaxy, that story where you can see those are marginal characters. They're characters that don't fit. And what are they doing? They're guarding the galaxy. They are guarding kind of the central core society in the galaxy from the even greater monsters beyond the margin, okay? And there's something to that, something that I can't even quite articulate, but the story is right. There's a place for people that don't fit to kind of protect society from the even more monstrous things than the people that don't fit, okay? And if they're given that space and saying, hey, we need you at the margin, you're valuable there, I don't think there's such a need to when these try to subvert the whole world and say, hey, we don't want to be at the margin anymore, we want to be in the center, we want everything to be, tear down this society and make it about us. I don't think that happens when the marginal characters are recognized as something that's going to be there and cared for and given their place of importance. So, this day being a day as it is, I'm not going to use specific examples of the marginal characters of our society because you say something wrong and, all hell breaks loose. But hopefully you get what I'm saying, and that in building a new metagame, you leave space for the margin and things will go better. Next one is competition. I'll probably be brief with this. That's a problem. I think it's another part of reality that I see, that competition is just a built-in part of human nature. What do you do about that? Because so often competition has turned to negative things in the past. So just some brief ideas is turn competition, just like manhood, because again, manhood has a lot of that competition, to things that make everyone better off. So a great example of this is that the city of Constantinople once had this schedule where I think it was the Huns were coming to attack the city, and the walls had fallen at this one point, and there was a tremendous amount of work to do before the Huns would arrive. So what did they do? They took, there was a lot of sporting going on at that times, and people that would support, I think, like different gladiators or different movements, things that were happening there in the arenas in the society. And so there was very much kind of like sporting groups that supported their team in those things. And so they got these groups, and they put them all building the walls, competing against each other for a prize, in order to get these walls done. And the story is that the walls were completed before the Huns were there, and the Huns were turned back. But you see how you take a competition like that and turn it into something that benefits everybody instead of degrading everyone. And I think sports does that a pretty good job at that. But that's just another principle, another rule, that when you accept competition as being a reality, and then you turn it towards making things better. So just to throw that out briefly. Problems that I don't have great solutions for is how we deal with sex and reproduction, which is always dependent on competition and status. So this is when we'll get into, in these later manhood videos, this fact that throughout human history it's been the case that a decent amount of men just get rejected. They're not allowed to, they're not selected by women, they're not allowed to reproduce, and there's always been this competitive element about, getting mates, and if you will, in life and around sex. So how do you deal with that in a better society? Good question to think about, one that I don't have great answers for at this moment. And then we already brought one up. This is the final one: how to deal with inherently limited things like lakefront property. How do you decide who gets, in such a society, how do you still decide who gets the lakefront property, who doesn't? Part of me wants to say, well, none of this is saying that markets shouldn't go away, and even things like money and currency and things like that. That's where you're not looking to outright wipe that all away, because there's certain things that markets do, which is kind of find ways to allocate property or not. But so I don't have all the answers there, but for sure, if you had this whole other value system in play at the same time, it would definitely be helpful, but it doesn't provide, just a crystal clear solution. So any suggestions down that way, or thinkers you think I should be thinking of or confronting, please let me know. Okay, and with that, we have done it. We've gotten through everything I wanted to cover with this idea of the metagame. In a lot of ways, I put out a lot of the core parts of the way I think, these core rules that sincerely, like my family and I, we are trying to implement right now, and trying to make it work and see if these rules could work in this little microcosm of our family and like myself in my individual life, because these things ultimately have to scale if they're going to work for a broader context. But if they do work at my life, if they do work in the life of my family, and if we can implement them even at the level of our community, that's a pretty good indication that they are actually rules and a game that's worth playing, a meaningful game. Somebody said, is the game fun? Well, games, not all of them are fun per se, especially the game of life, but it can be engaging, fulfilling. And if these rules end up doing a life or creating a game or making a game that is more fulfilling, and we can make them work at the level of our family, even if it's imperfect, then they might be worth scaling up. And so that's part of the reason we make videos, is to kind of show the process. And if we are successful at kind of living in a way that looks more engaging, well then it's something that can scale. Other people can mimic it. Other people can try it out. The rules that we have, in their infinite variations of how you can try things out. By no means are we trying to say that everybody needs to do exactly the same thing that we're doing, because we're just living by principles. We're taking the principles and finding a body, essentially, on earth here, ways to live out the principles. But there's all sorts of different ways that these rules could be applied. Infinite ways these rules could be applied around in society, and they'd look different at every place, but then still follow the same patterns. So that is all I have to say finally about the metagame. Tomorrow we'll move on. I think we'll be back to manhood. I'm looking forward to any of the last comments that have come in. Okay, love Giant Enemy Rooster. I'm seeing you guys just kind of talk, but then getting down, Giant Enemy Rooster says, love hearing your real life examples. The part about the cathedrals and gargoyles opened my mind to something I didn't know. Yes, and again, full credit due, this is completely Jonathan Pajot opened my mind to this thing about the margin. It's been one of the most powerful ideas that I've encountered, because it not only makes sense of these mysteries, like what is going on with these cathedrals? Like that makes no sense why you would have a butt trumpet, little elf or something on this beautiful cathedral out on the outside, and yet it kind of works. Why is this gargoyle there? Why is the water being funneled out of the gargoyle's mouth away from the building? You see how these marginal characters can funnel away dangerous things away from society if they're properly playing their part, right? And so when you look at society, how we're so wrapped up in this problem of what to do with the margin and what it means to love the margin, then you'll see that the answer has been there in the past. Societies have had to deal with the exact same reality, and they've showed us some ways in which to properly incorporate the margin into the framework of reality without having the margin, destroy the framework of reality. And you see, our society is very much on that path of trying to incorporate the margin, and in the process, destroying society's fundamental frameworks, right? And that doesn't work. There will be pain that will come from that, and what results often is a upside down world. So here's one more thought. It's like on the outside of cathedrals, what it kind of looks like sometimes is like a carnival, right? In the margins of these medieval books, it looks like very much like a carnival scene. These lewd behavior and crazy behavior and dressing up and things that don't fit. So that's great happening out in the margin, and oftentimes festivals. So here's another example of how this happens. Most societies have always had festivals where that for one day a year or seasonally or something, you recognize that part of reality. And so this is Carnival. This is the Feast of Fools, like you see in The Hunchback of Notre Dame, the Disney movie. And this is Halloween. There are these days. This is Purim for the Jews, where every Orthodox Jew is supposed to go out and get so drunk and spin around such that the room spins and whatnot. And so there's these days to invert everything. So that's great. It's great to have a carnival out there at the margin or at the margin of society, because we need those kind of, those flippings and renewings and spaces to get those parts of us out. But what you don't want is for that carnival happening outside of the cathedral to come in and be there at the altar, at the central point of the cathedral. And what was so funny is that Pajot even pointed out that there in the UK, sometime in the last couple of years, there was one of these cathedrals where they actually brought in this giant slide, carnival slide, and put it right there, next to the altar, and this was supposed to be fun and creative and whatnot, but literally you're bringing the carnival from the margin, putting it right there at the center, and that's what our society in large part has done, and flipped the world as to its hierarchy. So it's such a powerful idea of the dangers of the margin, but also the values of the margin, and that's finally a solution that feels satisfying to me. So I'm glad that it seems to be resonating with you as well. I'm also realizing I'm kind of cold out here. So if you ever see me kind of talking weird or something, it's because I'm actually cold delivering this in this environment. It's in the 40s or something. So you see I've got a jacket on and everything, just in case you were wondering. But I'm not seeing any more questions come in today. So if you have one, please put it out there, because I'm about to shut this down. I know this has probably been plenty of information, so I fully appreciate that there wouldn't be tons of questions by this point. Hopefully it's gotten your wheels turning, because we've barely been able to touch any of this. And what I want to do is each one of these rules and principles is so much better illustrated through something like a movie. You can find movies and characters and stories that really hit home almost all of these things, and it'd be so much more likely to get these ideas out and spread them if I can attach them to things like that. It's still the case that my videos that are video essays and my gladiator video and all these things do far better than these kinds of videos, for good reason. I mean, most people just can't digest, or but they don't want to digest things at such a level of someone just talking. They want to see it, they want to feel it, and see the same patterns, but just presented in a different format. So by me going over this stuff with you, again, the hope is that it forces me to articulate it better. Once it's articulated better, I can hone it into a package that is more easily spreadable. And so I appreciate you being part of helping me get these ideas to this point and give me your reactions. Again, more than anything, I would love to learn more about your lives. So find the ways little by little to let me know if these things are resonating with you. I want to know more about you as a person and you know what your life is like and your cares and concerns and triumphs and those things. So yeah, that is how I hope this ultimately proceeds. But this 90 days of streaming has definitely been good for me. It's been stretching me as to the ideas, it's been forcing me to package them and put them together, at least to be able to explain to you. And if you weren't there at the other end of them, I couldn't do this, right? So this, I hope, will turn into something good, even better over time. So thanks for being here. This is Gary signing off from Mission Top, and I look forward to the next one.